The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was watering my roses. Jessica's voice was cold, detached. Nothing like the warm young woman who had once called me Mom, with genuine affection. "Patricia," she said, and I knew immediately something was wrong. She never called me by my first name anymore. "We need to talk about the wedding arrangements. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I set down my watering can, my heart already sinking. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to fill with dread. "We've decided to keep the ceremony intimate. Very small, just immediate. Family and closest friends." "That sounds lovely," I replied, though something in her tone made me grip the phone tighter. "I'm looking forward to seeing the final guest list." Another pause. Longer this time. "That's what I'm calling about. We've had to make some difficult decisions about the guest count, some very difficult decisions." My mouth went dry. "Jessica, what are you trying to tell me?" "We think it would be best if you didn't attend the wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually stumbled backward, catching myself against the garden gate. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "You heard me correctly. We don't think your presence would be appropriate for the kind of celebration we're planning." I sank onto my garden bench, the phone trembling in my hand. This was my son Michael's wedding, my only child. The boy I'd raised alone after his father died when he was just 12. The young man I'd worked 3 jobs to put through college, who'd lived in my house until he was 28, saving money while I paid for everything. "Jessica, I don't understand. What have I done wrong? How have I been inappropriate?" Her laugh was sharp, cutting. "Oh, Patricia, always playing the victim. You know exactly what you've done." But I didn't know. That was the terrifying truth. I genuinely had no idea what had turned my future daughter-in-law against me so completely. 6 months ago, we'd been planning this wedding together, looking at flowers and discussing menu options. Now she was banning me from attending my own son's wedding. "Please, just tell me what's wrong. Whatever it is, we can work through it. We're going to be family." "That's where you're wrong," Jessica said, her voice dropping to something almost venomous. "We're not going to be family, not in any way that matters. You'll be Michael's mother, nothing more. And frankly, even that relationship needs boundaries." I sat in my garden for 20 minutes after Jessica hung up, staring at the roses I'd been so carefully tending. These were the same roses I'd planted when Michael graduated high school, dreaming of the day I'd cut them for his wedding bouquet. Now it seemed I wouldn't even be there to see him married. My name is Patricia Collins, and at 63, I thought I'd weathered the worst storms life could throw at me. I'd been wrong before. I met my late husband David when I was just 19, working as a secretary at the insurance company where he was starting as a claims adjuster. He was 22, ambitious, and had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. We married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at my parents' church, with big dreams and very little money. David worked his way up through the insurance company, while I supported us with various office jobs. When Michael was born 5 years later, we were finally stable enough for me to stay home, though money was always tight. David insisted I should be there for our son's early years, and I treasured every moment of it. Those were golden years, despite the financial struggles. David would come home from work and immediately take over baby duty, giving me a break while he bonded with Michael. We'd spend evenings planning for our son's future, talking about college funds and family vacations we'd take someday when David's career really took off. Then came that terrible night when Michael was 12. David had been working late, finishing up a complicated commercial claim. He was driving home in a thunderstorm when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on. The doctors said he died instantly, that he didn't suffer. I've held on to that small comfort for 38 years. Suddenly, I was a 34-year-old, widow with a traumatized sixth grader and a mortgage I couldn't afford on my part-time bookkeeping income. David's life insurance helped, but it wasn't enough to maintain our lifestyle indefinitely. I had to make choices, fast. I sold our house and bought a smaller one in a less expensive neighborhood, but still in the same school district, so Michael wouldn't have to change schools on top of losing his father. I took a full-time job at a medical office during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. On weekends, I did bookkeeping for small businesses from our kitchen table, while Michael did his homework beside me. It wasn't easy, but Michael and I developed a partnership that carried us through those difficult years. He'd come to the medical office after school and do his homework in the break room while I finished work. Then we'd go home together, where I'd help him with any subjects he was struggling with before heading out to my evening cleaning job. Michael never complained, not once. He understood that we were a team, that every sacrifice was an investment in his future. When his friends were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Michael was often with me, learning the value of hard work and family loyalty. By the time he reached high school, my hard work was paying off. The medical practice had promoted me to office manager, and my evening bookkeeping business had grown into a small but profitable accounting service. We moved to a nicer house, and I was able to give Michael opportunities I'd only dreamed of during those lean years. I paid for his SAT prep courses, his college application fees, and even hired a tutor for advanced calculus when he was struggling. When he got accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, I was so proud I cried right there in the kitchen while reading the acceptance letter. College was expensive, even with his scholarship, but I was determined that Michael would graduate debt-free. I'd seen too many young people starting their careers already buried under student loans. I worked extra hours, took on additional bookkeeping clients, and even sold some of David's collectibles that I'd been saving for sentimental reasons. Michael studied business with a focus on marketing, and he was brilliant at it. His professors consistently praised his work, and he graduated magna cum laude. I sat in that auditorium, watching him walk across the stage, and felt like every sleepless night and every sacrificed weekend had been worth it. After graduation, Michael moved back home while he looked for the right career opportunity. I was happy to have him there. The house had felt so empty during his college years, and I'd missed our conversations over dinner, our weekend trips to the farmer's market, our shared love of old mystery movies on Sunday afternoons. He found a position with a marketing firm in the city, but the salary was modest for someone just starting out. I encouraged him to stay at home and save money rather than waste it on rent for some tiny apartment. We'd developed such a comfortable routine during his college breaks that it felt natural to continue it. Michael would leave for work each morning in suits I'd helped him pick out, and return in the evenings with stories about office politics and challenging campaigns. I'd have dinner ready, and we'd talk about his day while eating at the same kitchen table where I'd once helped him with algebra homework. I loved those years. Michael was becoming a confident young professional, but he was still my son, still the boy who'd faced adversity with such maturity and grace. We'd drive to the cemetery together on his father's birthday and the anniversary of the accident, sharing memories and maintaining that connection to the man who'd shaped both our lives. It was during this time that I made what turned out to be the most important financial decision of my life, though I had no way of knowing it at the time. My accounting business had grown significantly, and I'd accumulated some savings beyond what I needed for daily expenses. One of my clients, a real estate developer named Frank Morrison, had been trying to convince me to invest in a property development he was planning on the outskirts of town. "Patricia," he'd said during one of our quarterly bookkeeping sessions, "you've got a sharp mind for numbers. You can see the potential here better than most people." The development was called Willowbrook Manor, and Frank's plans were ambitious. He wanted to create an upscale event venue and conference center on 50 acres of rolling hills about 20 minutes from downtown. The property included a historic mansion that would be renovated for weddings and special events, plus modern conference facilities for corporate retreats. I was skeptical at first. Real estate development seemed risky, and I'd always been conservative with money out of necessity. But Frank showed me the market research, the demographic studies, the projected returns. More importantly, he showed me the property itself. The mansion was breathtaking, even in its rundown state. Built in 1892 by a railroad baron, it featured soaring ceilings, hand-carved woodwork, and tall windows that looked out over manicured gardens that had grown wild, but still held traces of their former grandeur. Standing in what had once been the ballroom, I could envision brides walking down a grand staircase, families celebrating milestone anniversaries, couples renewing their vows under crystal chandeliers. Frank needed investors to purchase the property and fund the renovations. He was offering ownership stakes proportional to investment amounts, with the understanding that investors would receive both rental income from events and appreciation in property value over time. I went home and ran the numbers myself, analyzing them from every angle I could think of. The investment would take most of my savings, leaving me with minimal cash reserves. But the potential returns were significant, and Frank's business plan was solid. More importantly, something about the project spoke to me on an emotional level. Maybe it was because I'd never had the wedding I'd dreamed of as a young woman. David and I had married in my parents' church basement because we couldn't afford anything more elaborate. Maybe it was because I'd spent so many years focused purely on survival and practical matters that the idea of creating something beautiful, something that would bring joy to other families, appealed to my romantic side. I decided to invest, not everything I had, but a substantial portion of my savings. Frank was thrilled, and I became a minority partner in Willowbrook Manor, owning about 15% of the development. The renovation took 3 years and went over budget, as these projects always do. There were unexpected structural issues with the mansion, permit delays, and material cost overruns. Frank kept all the investors informed throughout the process, and most of us agreed to additional, small investments to keep the project moving forward. When Willowbrook Manor finally opened, it was even more spectacular than I'd imagined. The mansion had been restored to its original grandeur, and then some. The ballroom gleamed with refurbished parquet floors and crystal chandeliers. The gardens had been professionally landscaped to create intimate ceremony spaces and photo opportunities. The modern conference center had been designed to blend seamlessly with the historic architecture. But the real test was whether the business model would work. Would couples want to hold their weddings here? Would corporations book their retreats and conferences at our facility? The answer was a resounding yes. From the moment we opened, Willowbrook Manor was booked solid. The combination of historic elegance and modern amenities proved irresistible to couples planning their special day. Corporate clients loved the sophisticated atmosphere for important meetings and events. Within 2 years, my investment had doubled in value. By year 5, it had tripled. Frank had been right about the market demand, and the property had become one of the most sought-after venues in the region. Meanwhile, Michael's career was flourishing as well. He'd been promoted twice at the marketing firm and was earning a salary that finally allowed him to consider moving out on his own. We talked about it occasionally, but there was no rush. He was saving substantial money by living at home, and I enjoyed his company. It was around this time that Michael met Jessica. She was a colleague at his firm, working in the graphic design department. When Michael first mentioned her, his whole face lit up in a way I'd never seen before. He talked about her talent, her sense of humor, her intelligence. It was clear he was smitten from the very beginning. Jessica Richardson was 26, 2 years younger than Michael. She'd grown up in the suburbs with parents who were both professionals, her father a lawyer and her mother a real estate agent. She'd attended a private college and had what appeared to be a charmed life, at least from the outside. When Michael first brought her home for dinner, I was immediately struck by her beauty. Jessica was tall and slender with glossy dark hair and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was articulate and confident, the kind of young woman who'd clearly never doubted her place in the world. I made my best pot roast that night, along with homemade dinner rolls and the chocolate cake that had been Michael's favorite since childhood. I wanted to make a good impression, to show Jessica that she was welcome in our family. The dinner went well, I thought. Jessica complimented the food and asked thoughtful questions about my work and our family history. She seemed genuinely interested. When I showed her photos of Michael's childhood and told stories about his achievements in school, Michael was beaming, clearly proud to introduce the woman he was falling in love with to the mother who'd raised him. As their relationship progressed, Jessica became a regular presence in our home. She'd join us for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. I included her in family traditions, like our annual trip to pick out a Christmas tree and our tradition of watching classic movies on rainy Saturday afternoons. I thought we were developing a real relationship. Jessica would sometimes call me during the week just to chat, and she seemed to value my opinions on everything from career decisions to decorating choices for the apartment she and Michael eventually rented together. When they moved in together, after dating for about 18 months, I felt a natural sadness at Michael's departure, but also genuine happiness for the couple. They were clearly devoted to each other, and I could see that Jessica made Michael happier than I'd ever seen him. I helped them move, contributed some furniture from our house that they needed, and made sure their refrigerator was stocked with homemade meals for their first week in the new place. Jessica seemed grateful for all of it, hugging me tightly and telling me how lucky Michael was to have such a supportive mother. The proposal came 2 years later, and it was everything romantic that a young woman could want. Michael had planned an elaborate surprise, taking Jessica to the botanical gardens where they'd had their first official date, arranging for a string quartet to play her favorite song, and proposing at sunset beside the rose garden. Jessica called me that evening, practically breathless with excitement. "Patricia, we're engaged! Can you believe it? I'm going to marry your son!" I was thrilled for them, of course, but I was also touched that I was one of the first people they called with the news. It made me feel like I was truly part of their happiness, that my opinion and support mattered to both of them. The wedding. Planning began almost immediately. Jessica had been dreaming of her perfect wedding since childhood, and she had very specific ideas about what she wanted. The guest list would be around 200 people, a mix of family, friends, and professional contacts. The ceremony would be formal, with a full wedding party and traditional elements. From the very beginning, Jessica made it clear that she wanted to be involved in every detail. She'd researched venues extensively and had strong opinions about flowers, music, photography, and catering. Michael was happy to let her take the lead on most decisions, though he occasionally weighed in on things that were particularly important to him. As Jessica's future mother-in-law, I was eager to help however I could. I offered to contribute financially to the wedding, knowing that these events could be expensive and wanting to ensure that Jessica could have the celebration she'd always dreamed of. "That's so generous of you," Jessica had said when I made the offer. "Let me talk to Michael about what would be most helpful." What they decided would be most helpful was for me to handle some of the smaller details while they focused on the major decisions. I was put in charge of coordinating with the florist for centerpieces, managing the guest book and favor logistics, and handling transportation arrangements for out-of-town relatives. I threw myself into these responsibilities with enthusiasm. I spent hours researching options, getting quotes, and coordinating schedules. I wanted everything to be perfect for their special day, and I enjoyed feeling useful and included in the planning process. It was during one of these planning sessions that Jessica mentioned they were having trouble finding the perfect venue. They'd looked at dozens of possibilities, but nothing quite met their vision of elegant, intimate, and sophisticated. "We want somewhere that feels special," Jessica explained, "but not overly formal. Romantic, but not precious. It's harder to find than you'd think." I knew immediately what I had to do, though I waited several days before suggesting it. I didn't want to seem pushy or like I was trying to insert myself into their wedding in an inappropriate way. "I might have an idea about the venue," I finally said during one of our Sunday dinners. "Have you considered Willowbrook Manor?" Both Michael and Jessica looked interested immediately. Michael knew about my investment in the property, though I'd never discussed the financial details with him. Jessica had never heard of the venue, so I described the renovated mansion, the gardens, the elegant ballroom. "It sounds perfect," Jessica said, her eyes lighting up. "Can we go see it?" The tour was arranged for the following weekend, and I drove them out to the property myself. I'd been to Willowbrook Manor numerous times for investor meetings and special events, but seeing it through Jessica's eyes reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with the place initially. The mansion was at its most beautiful that day, with late afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows and highlighting the restored architectural details. The gardens were in full bloom, creating a fairy tale backdrop for photos. The ballroom, with its soaring ceiling and crystal chandeliers, took Jessica's breath away. "This is it," she whispered, spinning slowly to take in every detail. "This is exactly what I've been imagining." Michael was equally impressed, though he was more focused on practical considerations like capacity, catering facilities, and accessibility for elderly relatives. But I could see that he loved the place too, and was proud that his mother had been involved in creating something so beautiful. The venue manager, Sarah Chen, gave us a complete tour and explained all the services they offered. Willowbrook Manor provided full-service wedding planning, from ceremony coordination to reception management. They had preferred vendors for flowers, photography, and music, though couples were free to bring in their own if they preferred. The pricing was substantial, as it should be for a venue of this caliber. Sarah quoted them a figure that I could see made both Michael and Jessica take a sharp breath. It was more than they'd budgeted for, though not unreasonable for what was included. "Let me talk to Michael about the budget," Jessica said diplomatically, though I could see the disappointment in her eyes. That evening, I made a decision that seemed completely natural at the time, though it would later become the source of so much conflict. I called Frank Morrison and asked him about purchasing the venue exclusively for a private event. As an investor in Willowbrook Manor, I had certain privileges, including the option to book the venue for personal use at a reduced rate. But what I was proposing was different. I wanted to purchase the entire wedding package as a gift for Michael and Jessica. Frank was accommodating, as he always was with his investors. We worked out an arrangement where I would pay for the venue, basic catering, and coordination services as my wedding gift to the couple. It was a substantial amount of money, more than I'd ever spent on a single purchase besides my house, but I'd been conservative with my spending for so many years that I had the resources available. More importantly, it felt like the right thing to do. This was my only child's wedding, the culmination of all those years of sacrifice and hard work to give him a good life. Being able to provide Michael and Jessica with their dream venue felt like the perfect way to celebrate everything we'd accomplished together as a family. I called Michael the next day to tell him about my decision. "Mom, you can't be serious," he said, though I could hear the excitement underneath his protest. "That's way too much money. We can find somewhere else." "Michael," I said firmly, "this is important to me. You're my only child, and this is your wedding. I want it to be perfect, and I have the means to make that happen. Please let me do this for you and Jessica." There was a long pause before he responded. "Are you absolutely sure? I mean, really sure? Because once we book it, there's no going back." "I'm completely sure," I told him. "This is what I want to do with my money. What's the point of having it if I can't use it to make the people I love happy?" Michael's voice was thick with emotion when he replied, "Thank you, Mom. This means everything to us. Jessica is going to be so excited. And she was excited, at least initially. When Michael told her about my gift, she called me immediately to express her gratitude. "Patricia, I can't believe you would do this for us," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "It's the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me. I promise we'll make sure this wedding is everything you're hoping for." I felt so happy in that moment, so proud that I could give them this gift. It seemed like the perfect way to welcome Jessica into our family and to start our new relationship, as in-laws on a positive note. What I couldn't see at the time was that my generosity had fundamentally altered the dynamic between Jessica and me in ways that would eventually prove toxic. By purchasing their dream venue, I'd inadvertently created a power imbalance that would fester and grow until it exploded in that devastating phone call on a Tuesday morning in my garden. But in those early days after booking Willowbrook Manor, everything seemed perfect. Jessica threw herself into planning with renewed enthusiasm, knowing that the venue of her dreams was secured. Michael was relieved to have one major expense handled, freeing up their budget for other elements of the celebration they wanted to prioritize. I continued to help with the smaller details, working closely with Sarah Chen to coordinate logistics and ensure that every element would work seamlessly together. I felt more involved and valued than I had since Michael moved out, like I was playing an important role in this next chapter of his life. It would be months before I understood what I'd actually done, and by then, it would be too late to undo the damage. The first sign that something was shifting came 3 weeks after we'd booked Willowbrook Manor. I was at the venue meeting with Sarah Chen about menu selections when Jessica arrived unexpectedly, her expression tense and her usual warmth notably absent. "Patricia," she said coolly, barely acknowledging my presence before turning to Sarah. "I need to discuss some changes to our package, significant changes." I felt a flutter of unease, but tried to maintain my composure. "Of course, sweetheart. What kind of changes are you thinking about?" Jessica's jaw tightened at the endearment. "I think it would be better if I handled the venue communications directly from now on. This is, after all, my wedding." The emphasis on "my" was unmistakable, and it stung more than I cared to admit. "Absolutely," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just helping with some of the preliminary details, but I'm happy to step back." Sarah looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension between us. "Perhaps we could schedule separate meetings going forward," she suggested diplomatically. "Whatever works best for everyone involved." "That would be perfect," Jessica said, not looking at me. "I'll need to review everything that's been decided so far. I want to make sure the choices align with our vision. Our vision. Not my vision or Michael and my vision, but our vision in a way that deliberately excluded me." I gathered my purse and the planning folders I'd been working on, feeling dismissed and confused. "I'll leave these materials with you," I told Sarah, setting them on the conference table. "Jessica, please let me know if there's anything else I can do to help." Jessica finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in her eyes chilled me. There was something cold there, something calculating that I'd never noticed before. "I think we have everything under control from here." I drove home that afternoon feeling unsettled, but trying to rationalize what had happened. Wedding planning was stressful, and Jessica was probably feeling overwhelmed. She wanted more control over her special day, which was completely understandable. I was being overly sensitive, reading too much into what was likely just a normal assertion of boundaries. But over the following weeks, the pattern continued and intensified. Jessica stopped returning my calls as promptly as she used to. When we did speak, she was polite but distant, offering minimal details about wedding progress and deflecting my offers to help with anything else. Michael seemed oblivious to the change, or perhaps he was so caught up in his own work responsibilities that he didn't notice the subtle shifts in family dynamics. When I mentioned to him that Jessica seemed stressed about the wedding planning, he brushed off my concerns. She's just focused, Mom. You know how she gets when she's working on a big project. She wants everything to be perfect. I wanted to believe that explanation, but my instincts told me something deeper was happening. Jessica's behavior toward me had changed fundamentally, and I couldn't understand why. The second major incident occurred at what should have been a joyful occasion, Jessica's bridal shower. I'd offered to host it at my house, which had a lovely backyard perfect for entertaining, but Jessica had politely declined, saying she preferred to have it at her friend Sarah's apartment. I was hurt, but tried not to show it. When the invitation arrived, I was relieved to see my name on the guest list. At least I was still included in the celebration. The shower was beautiful, elegant in the way that reflected Jessica's impeccable taste. Her friends had outdone themselves with decorations, and the food was catered from an upscale restaurant downtown. I arrived with a carefully chosen gift, a set of vintage crystal glasses that had belonged to my grandmother, something I'd been saving for Michael's future wife. The first hour went smoothly enough. I chatted with Jessica's mother, Carol, whom I'd met several times and always gotten along with well. I made polite conversation with Jessica's college friends and co-workers, trying to find common ground and show genuine interest in their relationships with the bride. But as the afternoon progressed, I began to notice something troubling. There seemed to be inside jokes and references that I wasn't part of, conversations that would quiet when I approached, glances that excluded rather than included me. The breaking point came during the gift opening portion of the shower. Jessica opened present after present with enthusiasm, exclaiming over kitchen gadgets and home decor items, thanking each giver with personal anecdotes about their friendship or relationship. When she reached my gift, carefully wrapped in tissue, paper, and presented in an antique box that had belonged to my grandmother, her reaction was noticeably different. She opened it quietly, examined the crystal glasses without the excitement she'd shown for other gifts, and offered a simple, "Thank you, Patricia," before moving quickly to the next present. It was such a small thing, really. But in that moment, surrounded by Jessica's friends and family, I felt like an outsider in a way I'd never experienced before. The woman who was about to become my daughter-in-law was treating me like an obligation rather than someone she genuinely cared about. After the shower, as I was helping carry gifts to Jessica's car, I decided to address the elephant in the room directly. "Jessica, have I done something to upset you? I feel like things have been strained between us lately, and I'd really like to understand what's wrong." She stopped loading boxes and turned to face me, her expression carefully controlled. "Patricia, I think we need to establish some boundaries going forward." "What kind of boundaries?" "Michael and I are starting our own family now. We need space to build our relationship without constant involvement from outside parties." Outside parties. The phrase hit me like a slap. I was being relegated to the status of an outside party in my own son's life. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "I thought we had a good relationship. I thought you appreciated the support I've tried to provide." Jessica's smile was sharp-edged. "Your support has been overwhelming at times. The venue, the constant phone calls, the involvement in every detail of our lives. It's a lot, Patricia." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. "The venue was a gift. I thought you wanted it." "Of course I wanted it," she replied. "But gifts like that come with expectations, don't they? Strings attached." "There are no strings attached," I protested. "I just wanted to do something special for you and Michael." "Nothing that expensive comes without strings," Jessica said flatly. "Whether you admit it or not, you're using that venue to maintain control over our wedding, over our relationship, over Michael." The accusation was so unfair, so far from my intentions, that I felt tears pricking at my eyes. "That's not true. I would never try to control Michael's relationship." "Wouldn't you?" Jessica challenged. "You've been the primary woman in his life for so long that you can't step back and let him build a life with someone else. The venue purchase was just the most obvious example. I stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time that this wasn't about wedding stress or boundary setting. This was about Jessica's fundamental view of my role in Michael's life. And in her mind, that role needed to be drastically diminished. Jessica, Michael is my son. I love him, and I want him to be happy. That includes being happy with you. I'm not trying to interfere with your relationship. Then prove it, she said, her voice cold as winter air. Give us the space we need to start our marriage without your constant presence. I drove home that afternoon feeling shaken and confused. How had I gone from being a welcomed member of the family to being seen as an intrusive force that needed to be managed? What had I done that was so terrible it warranted this complete shift in treatment? That evening, I called Michael to talk about what had happened at the shower. I tried to be diplomatic, not wanting to create problems between him and Jessica, but needing to understand what was going on. "Mom, Jessica mentioned you had a conversation today," he said, his tone careful. "She said you seemed upset about something." "I'm concerned about the tension between Jessica and me," I admitted. "I don't understand what I've done wrong, and I'd like to fix whatever the problem is." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, Jessica feels like you've been a little too involved in our wedding planning. She's wondering if maybe you could step back a bit and let us handle things ourselves." "Step back from what, exactly?" "I bought you the venue and helped with a few small details. That's hardly overwhelming involvement." "The venue thing is actually part of the issue," Michael said, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice. "Jessica feels like such a big financial contribution creates pressure for her to include you in decisions that should be just between us." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "Michael, that venue was a gift, a wedding present. There was never any expectation that it would give me control over your wedding decisions." "I know that, and I told Jessica that, but she feels differently about it." "Then what does she want me to do? I can't take back the gift." "She wants you to be less involved going forward, more like a regular guest and less like a co-planner." The hurt in my voice was unmistakable when I replied. "I thought I was going to be family, not just a regular guest." "You are family, Mom. You'll always be family. But Jessica needs to feel like she and I are the primary decision makers in our own wedding and our own life." I understood the words he was saying, but they felt like a rejection of everything I'd tried to build with Jessica, everything I'd hoped our relationship could become. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll step back. But Michael, I need you to understand that everything I've done has been motivated by love for you and for Jessica. I've never tried to control or manipulate anything." "I know, Mom, and I love you for it. This is just about boundaries, not about your place in my life." But it felt like it was about my place in his life, and that place was becoming smaller and more marginalized with each passing week. The wedding planning continued without my involvement, as Jessica had requested. I heard updates through Michael, usually brief summaries of decisions that had already been made. The flowers had been chosen, the photographer booked, the menu finalized. Everything was progressing beautifully, I was told, though I was no longer part of the process. I tried to focus on other aspects of the celebration, like planning what I would wear and thinking about the speech I might give at the reception. I assumed I would be invited to speak, as the mother of the groom, though no one had explicitly asked me to prepare remarks. It was during this period that I began to notice other changes in Michael's behavior toward me. Our regular Sunday dinners became less frequent, often canceled at the last minute due to wedding-related commitments or social obligations with Jessica's family. When we did get together, Michael seemed distracted, less inclined toward the long conversations we'd always enjoyed. I tried not to take it personally. He was getting married, starting a new chapter of his life. It was natural that his priorities would shift. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica was actively working to distance him from me, creating a dynamic where spending time with his mother was somehow disloyal to his future wife. The situation came to a head 2 months before the wedding, during what should have been a routine conversation about logistics. I'd called Michael to ask about transportation arrangements for elderly relatives who would be attending the ceremony. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," he said, his tone serious in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Jessica and I have been discussing the wedding guest list, and we've had to make some difficult decisions." What kind of decisions?" "We've decided to make the wedding smaller than we originally planned, more intimate. We're limiting it to immediate family and very close friends." I felt a chill of premonition. "How much smaller?" "About half the size. We're cutting it down to around 100 people." "I see. And I assume my guest list will need to be reduced as well?" There was a pause that lasted too long. "Actually, Mom, we've had to make some really tough choices about the guest list. Some really difficult decisions that we didn't want to make." My heart started pounding. "Michael, what are you trying to tell me?" "We've decided that it would be best if the wedding were limited to immediate family only. Just parents and siblings." "I am immediate family," I said, confusion mixing with growing fear. Another pause. "Mom, Jessica feels like your presence at the wedding might create tension. She's worried that having you there will make her feel uncomfortable on what should be the happiest day of her life." The words hit me like a physical blow. "She doesn't want me at your wedding?" "It's not that she doesn't want you there exactly. It's just that she thinks it would be better for everyone if we kept the ceremony very small and private." "Michael, I'm your mother. How can your mother not be at your wedding?" "I know how this sounds, Mom, but Jessica has strong feelings about this, and it's her wedding day. I need to respect her wishes." I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "Are you telling me that I'm not invited? To my own son's wedding?" "You're invited to the reception," Michael said quickly, as if that somehow made the exclusion more palatable. "Just not the ceremony itself." "The reception that's being held at the venue I purchased for you?" Michael's silence was answer enough. I sat there for several minutes trying to process what I was hearing. My future daughter-in-law didn't want me at the wedding ceremony. My son was going along with this request. I was being asked to stay away from one of the most important moments of my child's life. "Michael," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you understand what you're asking of me?" "Mom, I know this is hard, but marriages require compromise, and this is important to Jessica." "What about what's important to me? What about our relationship?" "Our relationship isn't going anywhere. This is just about one day, about making sure Jessica feels comfortable on her wedding day." "And how do you think I'm supposed to feel, knowing that my presence at your wedding would make your wife uncomfortable? What does that say about how she views me?" Michael didn't have an answer for that question, and his silence spoke volumes. "I need some time to think about this," I told him. "This isn't a decision I can make quickly." "Of course, take whatever time you need. But Mom, please try to understand that this isn't about you personally. Jessica just wants the ceremony to be stress-free." After I hung up, I sat in my living room for hours, staring at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. Pictures of Michael as a baby, as a school-age child, graduating from high school and college. Pictures of him with David before his father died. And countless photos of just the two of us throughout the years when it was just us against the world. How had I gone from being the most important woman in his life to someone whose very presence was considered a source of stress? How had Jessica managed to convince him that excluding his own mother from his wedding was a reasonable request? But even as I struggled with the hurt and confusion, a small voice in the back of my mind was beginning to whisper something else. Something that would eventually grow into a roar of indignation and determination. I owned the venue where this wedding was taking place. I had purchased Willowbrook Manor as a gift for my son and his fiancée, never imagining that the same woman who had accepted my generosity would later use it to humiliate me. Jessica wanted to exclude me from the ceremony while still benefiting from my financial contribution. The irony was staggering, and as the full implications sank in, I realized that I had options Jessica hadn't considered when she made her cruel demand. The question was whether I had the courage to use them. 3 sleepless nights passed before I made the phone call that would change everything. I'd spent those days alternating between tears of hurt and flashes of anger so intense they surprised me. I'd raised Michael to be a man of integrity, someone who honored family bonds and treated people with respect. Watching him acquiesce to Jessica's cruel demand felt like witnessing the erosion of everything I'd tried to instill in him. But before I made any decisions about the wedding or the venue, I needed to understand how we'd reached this point. There had to be more to Jessica's hostility than she'd revealed. People don't develop such intense animosity without cause, and I was determined to discover what that cause might be. I called my friend Margaret Sullivan, who worked in human resources at the marketing firm where both Michael and Jessica were employed. Margaret and I had known each other since our children were in elementary school together, and I trusted her discretion completely. "Patricia, it's so good to hear from you," Margaret said warmly when she answered. "How are the wedding preparations going? Actually, that's why I'm calling. I'm hoping you might be able to help me understand something about Jessica's behavior lately." Margaret's tone shifted slightly, becoming more careful. "What kind of behavior?" I explained the situation as objectively as I could, describing Jessica's increasing hostility and the ultimatum about the wedding attendance. Margaret listened without interrupting, but I could sense her growing discomfort with the conversation. "Patricia, I have to be careful about discussing employees. You understand?" "Of course. I'm not asking you to betray any confidences. I just need to understand if there's something I've missed, some context that might explain what's happening." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Have you considered that Jessica might feel threatened by your relationship with Michael?" "Threatened? How?" "You and Michael have an unusually close bond. Some women might find that intimidating, especially if they're trying to establish themselves as the primary woman in their partner's life." I'd considered this possibility, but it still didn't fully explain the intensity of Jessica's rejection. "But I've tried to welcome her into the family. I've never competed with her for Michael's attention." "Sometimes the threat isn't about competition," Margaret said carefully. "Sometimes it's about comparison." "What do you mean?" Another pause. "Patricia, you raised Michael on your own after David died. You worked multiple jobs to put him through college debt-free. You've been incredibly selfless and devoted. For some people, that kind of example can feel impossible to live up to." The insight hit me like a revelation. Was it possible that Jessica's hostility stemmed not from anything I'd done, but from her own insecurity about measuring up to the mother who'd sacrificed everything for her son? Has Jessica said anything at work about feeling pressure to meet certain expectations? Margaret's hesitation told me she knew more than she was comfortable sharing. I can't discuss specific conversations, but I will say that wedding planning can bring out complicated feelings about family dynamics and future relationships. After I hung up with Margaret, I found myself viewing the situation from an entirely different angle. If Jessica felt threatened by my relationship with Michael, then my financial generosity with the venue would have intensified that threat rather than alleviating it. Instead of seeing my gift as an act of love and welcome, she might have interpreted it as a display of power, a demonstration of my continued importance in Michael's life. The realization didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me understand the psychology behind it. Jessica wasn't just trying to exclude me from the wedding. She was trying to establish herself as the most significant woman in Michael's life by diminishing my role and influence. Armed with this understanding, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of confronting Jessica directly or demanding explanations from Michael, I would gather more information about what was really happening in their relationship and their wedding plans. I started by reaching out to Frank Morrison, my business partner at Willowbrook Manor. As one of the primary investors, I had access to booking information and financial records for events held at the venue. What I discovered when I reviewed the details of Michael and Jessica's wedding arrangements shocked me completely. The contract for their wedding was far more elaborate than what I'd originally arranged. The basic package I'd purchased had been upgraded significantly to include premium catering options, additional floral arrangements, enhanced lighting design, and luxury transportation services. The total cost had nearly doubled from my original gift. More troubling was how these upgrades were being financed. According to the payment records, Jessica had established a line of credit to cover the additional expenses, using the venue booking as collateral. She was essentially borrowing against my gift to fund enhancements I'd never agreed to support. But the most revealing detail was in the guest list documentation. The wedding wasn't being scaled down to 100 people as Michael had told me. According to the catering orders and seating charts, they were expecting nearly 200 guests, the original size they'd planned from the beginning. Jessica had lied about reducing the guest count to justify excluding me from the ceremony. She was having the large, elaborate wedding she'd always wanted, but she was determined that I wouldn't be there to see it. The deception cut deeper than her original hostility. This wasn't about boundaries or stress management. It was about deliberate cruelty designed to humiliate me while still benefiting from my financial support. I scheduled a meeting with Frank to discuss my options regarding the venue booking. As an investor and the person who'd paid for the original package, I needed to understand what rights and protections I had. Frank's office at Willowbrook Manor overlooked the gardens where Michael and Jessica were planning to hold their ceremony. Sitting across from his desk, looking out at the space where my son would marry without me present, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and determination. "Patricia, I have to say I'm surprised by what you've told me," Frank said after I'd explained the situation. Most families work through these kinds of conflicts rather than involving business relationships. "This isn't a typical family conflict," I replied. "I'm being deliberately excluded from my son's wedding while my financial contribution is being used to fund the celebration. That creates some ethical complications." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Let me review the contracts and see what options might be available. As the person who paid for the original booking, you do have certain rights, though exercising them could have significant consequences for your family relationships." "What kind of rights?" "Well, technically, the original contract is in your name as the purchaser. The upgrades Jessica arranged are addendums to that base contract. If you chose to cancel the original booking, the entire event would be affected." The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but now that Frank had mentioned it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had the power to cancel their venue entirely, to force them to find an alternative location just weeks before their wedding date. It was a nuclear option, one that would cause massive disruption and probably destroy any remaining possibility of reconciliation with Jessica and Michael. But it would also send a clear message that my generosity couldn't be taken for granted, while I was being treated with such disrespect. "I need some time to think about this," I told Frank. "Can you prepare documentation showing exactly what my rights are regarding the booking?" "Of course. But Patricia, I hope you'll consider the long-term implications before making any drastic decisions. Family relationships are harder to repair than business contracts." I left Frank's office with more questions than answers, but also with a newfound sense of agency. For weeks, I'd felt powerless in the face of Jessica's hostility and Michael's acquiescence. Now I understood that I had significant leverage in this situation if I chose to use it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since David died. I called my sister Ellen in Phoenix and asked for advice about a major life decision. Ellen was 3 years younger than me, but she'd always been the more assertive of the two of us. She'd built a successful career as a corporate lawyer and had raised 2 daughters as a single mother after her divorce. If anyone could help me think through the ethical and practical implications of my situation, it was Ellen. "Let me get this straight," Ellen said after I'd explained everything. "Your future daughter-in-law is excluding you from your son's wedding, lying about the reasons, upgrading the celebration on your dime, and your son is going along with all of this?" "That's essentially correct. And you're wondering whether you should cancel the venue you purchased for them?" "I'm wondering whether it would be justified." Ellen's laugh was sharp and incredulous. "Patricia, you're being too nice about this. What they're doing is unconscionable. Jessica is using your gift to fund her dream wedding while treating you like an unwanted intruder. Michael is allowing his mother to be humiliated to keep his fiancée happy. They both deserve consequences. But if I cancel the venue, I'll probably lose my relationship with Michael permanently." "What relationship?" Ellen challenged. "He's already choosing Jessica's unreasonable demands over basic respect for his mother. You raised him better than this, and if he can't see how wrong this situation is, maybe some dramatic consequences are exactly what he needs." Ellen's perspective was validating but also frightening. Taking action against the venue would be irreversible, and the fallout would be immediate and intense. But continuing to accept the current treatment seemed equally untenable. "What would you do in my situation?" I asked. "I'd give them one chance to make it right," Ellen said without hesitation. "I'd explain exactly what I knew about their deceptions and give them the opportunity to correct course. If they refused or tried to justify their behavior, I'd cancel everything and let them deal with the consequences." After talking with Ellen, I spent the next day crafting a letter that laid out everything I'd discovered and offered Michael and Jessica a clear choice. I could continue to support their wedding as originally planned, but only if I was treated as a welcomed family member rather than an inconvenient obligation. The letter was direct, but not accusatory, factual, but not vindictive. I explained that I'd learned about the venue upgrades and the actual guest count, and that I understood these discrepancies meant they'd been deliberately misleading me about their plans. I offered to continue my support for their celebration, but only if we could establish honest communication and mutual respect going forward. I also made it clear that if they preferred to exclude me from the wedding, I would respect that decision, but I wouldn't continue to financially support an event from which I was being banned. They could keep the venue, but they would need to assume full financial responsibility for both the original package and the upgrades they'd arranged. The letter ended with a request for a face-to-face conversation within the next week, where we could discuss the situation openly and reach a resolution that honored everyone's needs and boundaries. I hand-delivered the letter to their apartment on a Thursday evening, leaving it with a note asking them to read it carefully and call me when they were ready to talk. Then I went home and waited. The call came 2 days later, but it wasn't the conversation I'd hoped for. "Mom, what the hell is wrong with you?" Michael's voice was angry in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "Jessica is hysterical. She thinks you're trying to sabotage our wedding." "I'm trying to understand why I'm being lied to and excluded," I replied calmly. "And I'm asking for honesty about what's really happening. You had no right to investigate our wedding arrangements like some kind of private detective. Those contracts are none of your business." "The contracts I'm paying for are absolutely my business, Michael. And the deceptions about guest count and venue costs are my business too, since they directly affect my financial obligations." "We never asked you to pay for the venue," Michael said, though his tone was less certain now. "You accepted the gift gratefully, and then you used it as collateral to secure credit for upgrades you couldn't afford. That's not the same as declining my generosity." There was a long pause before Michael spoke again. "What do you want, Mom? What would it take for you to stop interfering in our wedding?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how he now viewed our relationship. I wasn't a beloved family member trying to navigate a difficult situation. I was an interfering obstacle to be managed and appeased. "I want honesty," I said simply. I want to be treated with the respect due to someone who's loved and supported. You, your entire life. And I want to understand why Jessica considers my presence at your wedding so threatening that she's willing to lie and manipulate to prevent it. Jessica doesn't owe you explanations about her feelings, Michael replied. And neither do I. You're not entitled to be at our wedding just because you paid for the venue. His words hit me like a slap. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd sacrificed everything to support through college and beyond, and he was telling me that I wasn't entitled to attend his wedding. You're right, I said quietly. I'm not entitled to attend your wedding. But I'm also not obligated to pay for a celebration that excludes me. If you and Jessica want to plan your wedding without my involvement, you're free to do that. But you'll need to do it without my financial support as well. Are you threatening to cancel the venue? Michael's voice was sharp with alarm. I'm offering you a choice. Include me as a welcomed family member, or exclude me completely. But you can't have both my money and my absence. That's blackmail. No, Michael. That's dignity. Something I should have insisted on weeks ago. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and grief. I'd just given my son an ultimatum that could destroy our relationship forever. But I'd also finally stood up for myself in a way that honored the values David and I had tried to instill in Michael during his childhood. The next few days passed in terrible silence. No calls, no texts, no contact from either Michael or Jessica. I began to wonder if I'd made a catastrophic mistake, if my insistence on respect and honesty would cost me my son permanently. But then, on Monday morning, something unexpected happened that would change the entire trajectory of the conflict. The unexpected visitor at my door was Carol Richardson, Jessica's mother, and she looked as composed and determined as her daughter usually did. But there was something different in her expression, something that looked almost like embarrassment mixed with resolve. Patricia, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, she said, her voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there in our previous interactions. I think we need to have a conversation about what's been happening between our children. I invited her in, offering coffee that she declined with a polite shake of her head. Carol settled into my living room chair with the careful posture of someone preparing for a difficult discussion. I owe you an apology, she began, which was the last thing I'd expected to hear. I've learned some things about Jessica's behavior toward you that I find deeply troubling, and I wanted to address them directly. My heart began to race. What kind of things? Carol's composure wavered slightly. Jessica has been sharing details about your family situation with me and her father, details that paint you in a very unflattering light. She's been building a case against you for months, describing you as controlling, manipulative, and inappropriately involved in their relationship. I felt a chill of recognition. This explained so much about the shift in family dynamics, the growing sense that I was being systematically excluded and undermined. What specifically has she told you? She claimed that you were using the venue purchase to control their wedding decisions, that you were demanding input on everything from the guest list to the menu selections. She said you were making their engagement about yourself rather than about their relationship. Each accusation hit like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they were such calculated distortions of reality. Carol, none of that is accurate. I purchased the venue as a gift and then stepped back from planning when Jessica requested space. I'm beginning to understand that, Carol said, her voice heavy with regret. This weekend, Jessica let something slip that made me realize how much she's been manipulating the narrative. What did she say? Carol looked directly at me, her expression pained. She was talking to her friend Sarah on the phone, and I overheard her bragging about how she'd managed to get rid of the mother-in-law problem while still keeping the expensive venue. She was laughing about how easy it had been to turn Michael against you. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Jessica hadn't just been excluding me from the wedding. She'd been actively working to damage my relationship with Michael, and she'd been proud of her success. She actually said that? Those exact words. Mother-in-law problem. Like you were some kind of obstacle to be eliminated rather than the woman who raised the man she claims to love. I sat back in my chair, trying to process this confirmation of what I'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. Jessica's hostility hadn't been about boundaries or wedding stress. It had been a deliberate campaign to remove me from Michael's life. "There's more," Carol continued, her voice becoming even more strained. "Jessica has been working on Michael systematically, feeding him stories about your supposed interference, interpreting every gesture of support as an attempt to control him. She's been very strategic about it." "How do you know all this?" "Because this weekend, she tried to recruit me to help with the final phase of her plan." My blood went cold. "What final phase?" Carol's hands were trembling slightly as she spoke. "She wants to convince Michael to cut off contact with you entirely after the wedding. She's been building toward this goal for months, and she thinks the venue situation gives her the perfect opportunity to make it happen." I felt like the room was spinning around me. Cut off contact entirely? She believes that Michael will be happier without what she calls maternal manipulation in his life. She's convinced herself that your close relationship with him is unhealthy and that she's helping him by ending it. The scope of Jessica's manipulation was breathtaking. She hadn't just wanted to exclude me from the wedding, she'd wanted to eliminate me from Michael's life completely. The venue controversy was just her chosen weapon to achieve that goal. "Carol, why are you telling me this? Why are you betraying your daughter's confidence?" Carol's composure finally cracked, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "Because what she's doing is wrong. Deeply fundamentally wrong. You're a good woman who raised a wonderful son, and you don't deserve to be treated this way." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "And because I'm terrified that if Jessica can do this to you, she'll eventually do it to anyone who doesn't serve her purposes, including me and her father." The admission revealed Carol's own vulnerability in this situation. She was recognizing that Jessica's willingness to manipulate and exclude family members could eventually be turned against anyone who crossed her. What does Jessica's father think about all this? Richard doesn't know the full extent of what's been happening. Jessica has been more careful around him, but I think he's starting to sense that something isn't right. He's asked me several times why you weren't more involved in the wedding planning, and I haven't known how to answer. I appreciated Carol's honesty, but I also felt overwhelmed by the implications of what she was telling me. If Jessica had been this calculating about destroying my relationship with Michael, how could I possibly counter her influence at this point? "Carol, I gave Michael an ultimatum about including me in the wedding or losing my financial support. He hasn't responded, and I'm starting to think I may have lost him permanently." "You gave him what he needed," Carol said firmly. "Someone had to force him to confront what Jessica has been doing. He's a good man underneath all this manipulation, Patricia. He just needs to see the situation clearly." "But what if he doesn't? What if Jessica's influence is too strong?" Carol leaned forward in her chair, her expression intense. "Then you fight for him. You don't let her win without making sure Michael understands exactly what he's losing." We talked for another hour, with Carol sharing more details about Jessica's manipulative tactics and her own growing concerns about her daughter's character. By the time she left, I had a much clearer picture of what I was facing, and I'd made a decision about how to proceed. That evening, I called Frank Morrison and asked him to prepare the paperwork to cancel Michael and Jessica's venue booking. If they weren't going to respond to my ultimatum with honesty and respect, then I would follow through on the consequences I'd outlined. But I also decided to take one more step, one that Carol's revelations had convinced me was necessary. I was going to expose Jessica's manipulation to Michael directly, in a way that would force him to confront the truth about what had been happening. I spent the next day drafting a comprehensive letter that documented everything I'd learned about Jessica's campaign against me. I included details about the venue upgrades she'd arranged without my knowledge, the lies about the guest count, and most importantly, the information Carol had shared about Jessica's goal of eliminating me from Michael's life entirely. The letter was longer than I'd originally intended, but I needed Michael to understand the full scope of what had been happening. This wasn't about a few disagreements or boundary issues. It was about a systematic effort to destroy our relationship, based on calculated deception. I also included copies of the venue contracts showing the financial manipulations, and I provided Carol's phone number so Michael could verify the information about Jessica's conversations if he chose to do so. The final paragraph of the letter was the most difficult to write. Michael, I have loved you unconditionally your entire life, and I have tried to support your happiness in every way I could. If you genuinely believe that your life will be better, without me in it, I will respect that decision and step aside. But I will not continue to be manipulated, lied to, and financially exploited while pretending that this treatment is acceptable. The choice is yours, but it needs to be made with full knowledge of what has really been happening. I hand-delivered the letter that evening, along with a formal notice from Frank Morrison stating that the venue booking would be canceled within 48 hours unless alternative arrangements were made. Then I went home and waited for Michael's response, knowing that whatever happened next would determine the future of our relationship permanently. The call came at 7:30 the following morning, and Michael's voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. He sounded shattered, exhausted, and furious all at the same time. "Mom, we need to talk. Can I come over right now?" "Of course," I replied, my heart pounding with hope and fear in equal measure. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, still, in his work clothes from the night before, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red-rimmed and his hair was disheveled, and he was carrying the letter I'd written clutched in his hand. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble. "Everything in this letter? Is it all true?" "Every word," I replied quietly. "I documented everything carefully, and Carol Richardson can verify the conversation she overheard." Michael collapsed into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "I called Mrs. Richardson at 6 this morning. She confirmed everything. Everything, Mom." I sat down across from him, waiting for him to continue. "Jessica has been lying to me for months. About you, about the venue, about her motivations for everything. She's been feeding me stories about your behavior that made me question our entire relationship." "What kind of stories?" "She told me you were trying to control our wedding because you couldn't let go of being the most important woman in my life. She said you were using the venue purchase to manipulate us into including you in decisions that should be private. She made it sound like your involvement was pathological." I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. "And you believed her?" Michael's voice broke slightly. "She was so convincing, Mom. She had explanations for everything, interpretations of your behavior that made it seem like you were the problem. And she was subtle about it. Never directly attacking you, just expressing concern about our family dynamics." "She's very skilled at manipulation," I acknowledged. "I think she's been planning this campaign for a long time. Mrs. Richardson thinks Jessica sees you as competition for my attention and loyalty. She wanted to eliminate that competition by turning me against you." I watched my son struggle with the realization of how thoroughly he'd been deceived, and I felt heartbroken for both of us. Jessica had damaged our relationship so severely that even this revelation might not be enough to repair it completely. "Michael, the question now is what you want to do with this information." He looked up at me with eyes full of pain and regret. "I want to make it right, Mom. I want to fix what I've allowed to happen to us." "And what about Jessica?" Michael's expression hardened. "My engagement to Jessica is over. I can't marry someone who would manipulate me into destroying my relationship with my own mother. The woman I fell in love with doesn't exist. She was just a performance designed, to get what Jessica wanted. I felt relief flood through me, but also concern for the pain Michael was obviously experiencing. "Are you sure? This is a huge decision to make so close to the wedding." "I'm completely sure. I've been thinking about it all night, and I keep coming back to the same realization. If Jessica could do this to you, she could do it to anyone who gets in her way. Our children, my friends, anyone who might compete for my attention or loyalty." He paused, looking directly at me. "And Mom, what she did to you is unforgivable. You've sacrificed everything for me my entire life, and I let her convince me that your love and support were somehow toxic. I will never forgive myself for that." I reached across and took his hand. "You were being manipulated by someone you trusted. That's not your fault." "It is my fault," he insisted. "I should have trusted my instincts about our relationship. I should have questioned why someone who claimed to love me would want to isolate me from the person who'd been my biggest supporter my entire life." We talked for 3 hours that morning, working through the damage that Jessica's manipulation had caused and beginning the process of rebuilding our relationship. Michael shared details about how Jessica had systematically undermined his confidence in our bond, and I shared my own experience of being gradually excluded and demonized. By the time he left, we had a plan for moving forward, and I had my son back. The confrontation with Jessica came later that afternoon, and it was everything I'd expected it to be and more. Michael had called her and asked her to come to my house for a conversation about the wedding arrangements. She arrived expecting to find him ready to cut ties with me permanently, but instead, she found both of us waiting for her with evidence of her months-long campaign of deception. "Michael, what is this?" Jessica asked when she saw us sitting together at my kitchen table. "Why are we meeting here?" "We're here to discuss your lies," Michael said simply. "All of them." Jessica's composure faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The venue upgrades you arranged without telling my mother. The lies about reducing the guest count. The systematic campaign to turn me against her. Should I continue?" I watched Jessica's face as she realized that her manipulation had been exposed. Instead of showing remorse or attempting to defend her actions, she shifted immediately into attack mode. "Patricia, you manipulative witch," she hissed, her careful facade disappearing completely. "You couldn't stand that Michael chose me over you, so you've been plotting to destroy our relationship from the beginning." "Actually," I replied calmly, "that's exactly what you've been doing to me." "Michael, you can't seriously believe her." "Over me," Jessica pleaded, but her voice carried a note of desperation now. "She's been trying to come between us since the day we got engaged." "Jessica, your own mother confirmed the conversations she overheard," Michael said quietly. "There's no point in continuing to lie." Jessica's mask slipped completely then, revealing the calculating, vindictive person who'd been hiding beneath the charming exterior. "Fine," she snapped. "Yes, I wanted her out of our lives. Yes, I worked to make that happen, and I'd do it again because your relationship with your mother is unhealthy and codependent." "Our relationship is loving and supportive," Michael replied. "Something you clearly don't understand. Your mother has been controlling your life for 30 years, Jessica shot back. "She manipulated you into living with her until you were 28. She used financial support to maintain her influence over your decisions. She bought our venue to ensure she'd have a permanent role in our marriage. The accusations were so far from reality that they would have been laughable if they hadn't caused so much damage." "Jessica," I said quietly, "I supported Michael because I love him. Every sacrifice I made was motivated by wanting him to have the best possible future. That's what mothers do." "That's what controlling mothers do," she retorted. "Healthy mothers let their children build independent lives." "I encouraged Michael's independence," I replied. "You tried to destroy his family relationships. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Jessica alternating between attacks, denials, and attempts to justify her behavior. But it was clear that she felt no genuine remorse for what she'd done, only anger at being caught. Finally, Michael stood up and took off his engagement ring, setting it on the table between us. "Jessica, our engagement is over. I can't marry someone who would manipulate me into abandoning my family." "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Jessica said, but her voice was cold rather than heartbroken. "You'll never find anyone else who was willing to put up with your mother's interference." "Then I'll be alone," Michael replied. "But I'll be alone with my integrity intact." Jessica left without another word, and the wedding that had caused so much conflict was suddenly no longer an issue. But as I watched her walk out of my house and out of our lives, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. Jessica struck me as someone who didn't accept defeat gracefully, and I wondered what her next move might be. The weeks following Michael's broken engagement were unlike anything I'd experienced since David's death. The house felt different, charged with possibility and renewal rather than the heavy silence of loss. Michael had moved back home temporarily while he sorted through the emotional and practical aftermath of ending his relationship with Jessica, and having him there reminded me of how much joy his presence brought to my daily life. But the transition wasn't without its challenges. Michael was processing not just the end of his engagement, but the devastating realization of how completely he'd been manipulated. He'd spent months questioning his own judgment, his relationship with me, and his understanding of love and loyalty. Jessica's psychological manipulation had been so sophisticated that even knowing the truth didn't immediately erase its effects. Some mornings I'd find him sitting at the kitchen table before dawn, staring at his coffee cup with a troubled expression that broke my heart. The man who'd always been confident and decisive was now second-guessing every emotion, every memory, every relationship in his life. "Mom," he said one particularly difficult morning, "how do I know that anything I felt for Jessica was real? How do I trust my own judgment about people anymore?" I set down my own coffee and considered his question carefully. This wasn't the kind of problem that could be solved with platitudes or false reassurance. Michael needed to rebuild his confidence in his own perceptions, and that would take time and honest reflection. "The feelings you had for Jessica were real," I told him. "You fell in love with the person she presented herself to be. The manipulation wasn't about creating false emotions. It was about hiding her true character until she felt secure enough to reveal it." "But I should have seen through it," he insisted. "There must have been signs I ignored." Maybe there were, but recognizing manipulation while you're experiencing it is incredibly difficult, especially when it comes from someone you trust completely. Jessica was skilled at what she was doing, Michael. Don't blame yourself for being vulnerable to someone you loved. These conversations became a regular part of our mornings, and gradually I watched Michael begin to separate Jessica's deceptions from his own authentic experiences. He started to understand that being manipulated didn't make him weak or naive. It made him human. Meanwhile, the practical aspects of canceling a wedding proved to be surprisingly complex. Even though the engagement was over, there were vendors to notify, deposits to recover, and gifts to return. Michael threw himself into these tasks with the same methodical approach he brought to his work, treating each canceled arrangement as a step toward freedom rather than a loss. The most complicated situation involved Willowbrook Manor itself. Frank Morrison was sympathetic to our circumstances, but the venue had turned down other bookings for that date, and the elaborate upgrades Jessica had arranged couldn't simply be undone without financial consequences. After several discussions with Frank and the venue's management team, we reached a creative solution that satisfied everyone involved. Michael would take over the financial responsibility for the upgrades Jessica had arranged, but instead of canceling the event entirely, we would transform it into something completely different. What if we used the date for a family reunion instead? Michael suggested during one of our planning sessions with Frank. We could invite relatives we haven't seen in years, celebrate our family rather than a marriage that was never going to work. The idea appealed to me immediately. My side of the family was scattered across the country, and we rarely had opportunities to gather in one place. David's relatives had maintained contact over the years, but geographic distance made regular visits difficult. A reunion at Willowbrook Manor would be a perfect way to bring everyone together while making positive use of the venue booking. As word spread about our changed plans, the response was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. Cousins I hadn't seen since Michael's high school graduation confirmed their attendance. David's brother Robert, who lived in California, planned a cross-country trip with his entire family. My sister Ellen offered to help coordinate travel arrangements for elderly relatives who needed assistance. The guest list grew to include nearly 100 family members, spanning 3 generations and representing connections that had been neglected during the busy years of building careers and raising children. Instead of celebrating a wedding that had been tainted by manipulation and deception, we would be honoring the bonds that had sustained our family through decades of joy and challenge. Michael embraced the reunion planning with an enthusiasm that surprised me. He created a family tree display for the event, researching genealogy and gathering photographs that told the story of our extended family's history. He organized activities that would appeal to different age groups and planned a program of toasts and presentations that would celebrate family milestones and achievements. "This feels right, Mom," he told me as we reviewed the final preparations. "This feels like something Dad would have loved." The comment brought tears to my eyes because it was so perfectly true. David had treasured family connections and would have been thrilled to see everyone gathered together in celebration of the bonds he'd valued so deeply. But even as we moved forward with positive plans, Jessica's shadow continued to loom over our lives in unexpected ways. 3 weeks after the broken engagement, she began a campaign of harassment that was both petty and vindictive. It started with anonymous emails sent to Michael's work colleagues, alleging that he had commitment issues and had abandoned his fiancée without explanation. The emails were carefully crafted to sound concerned rather than malicious, but their intent was clearly to damage Michael's professional reputation. Then came the social media campaign. Jessica created fake accounts and began posting negative reviews of my accounting business, claiming I had provided poor service and engaged in unethical practices. The reviews were specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be difficult to disprove. Most disturbing were the attempts to sabotage our family reunion. Jessica somehow obtained information about our guest list and began contacting relatives directly, claiming that the reunion was actually a desperate attempt to replace her wedding and that the family was being manipulated into participating in my revenge fantasy. The calls were sophisticated enough to fool some relatives who didn't know the full story of what had happened. Jessica presented herself as concerned about family harmony and suggested that attending the reunion would be taking sides in a conflict they didn't fully understand. Michael was furious when he learned about these tactics. "She's trying to isolate us from our own family now," he said, his voice tight with anger. "This has to stop." We consulted with an attorney about our options for legal action, but Jessica had been careful to avoid anything that would constitute clear harassment or defamation. Her methods were subtle and difficult to prove, designed to cause maximum damage while providing her with plausible deniability. Instead of engaging in a legal battle that might drag on for months, we decided to counter Jessica's campaign with transparency and honesty. Michael drafted a letter to his work colleagues explaining the situation factually and professionally, acknowledging that his engagement had ended due to incompatibility issues and asking for privacy during a difficult personal transition. I addressed the negative reviews of my business by encouraging satisfied clients to share their positive experiences online, effectively drowning out Jessica's false complaints with authentic testimonials. Most importantly, we reached out to family members directly, sharing the true story of what had happened and inviting them to make their own decisions about attending the reunion based on accurate information rather than Jessica's manipulative presentations. The response from our family was overwhelmingly supportive. Not only did Jessica's tactics fail to discourage attendance, they actually strengthened our relatives' resolve to show solidarity with Michael and me. Several family members shared their own experiences with manipulative relationships, offering perspective and support that helped Michael continue his healing process. Ellen flew in a week early to help with final preparations, and her presence brought an energy and confidence that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Having another strong woman in the house reminded me that I'd successfully navigated difficult challenges before and would continue to do so. "You handled this situation brilliantly," Ellen told me as we arranged flowers for the reunion centerpieces. "You stood up for yourself when it mattered. You protected your relationship with Michael, and you turned a potentially devastating situation into something positive." "I'm not sure I handled anything brilliantly," I replied. "I mostly just refused to accept being treated badly." "That's exactly what makes it brilliant," Ellen insisted. "Too many people accept mistreatment because they're afraid of conflict, or they think being accommodating will somehow improve the situation. You recognize that Jessica's behavior was unacceptable, and you enforced consequences." Ellen's perspective helped me understand that my response to Jessica's manipulation hadn't been an act of desperation or revenge, but rather an assertion of dignity and self-respect that had ultimately protected my family from further damage. The day of the reunion arrived with perfect weather and an atmosphere of genuine celebration. Willowbrook Manor had never looked more beautiful, with the gardens in full bloom and the mansion gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The staff had outdone themselves with decorations that honored our family history while creating an elegant backdrop for our gathering. Watching relatives reconnect after years of separation, seeing children meet cousins for the first time, and hearing stories of family adventures and achievements filled my heart with more joy than I'd experienced in months. This was what family celebrations should be about: love and connection rather than social climbing and financial manipulation. Michael gave a toast during dinner that brought tears to my eyes and pride to my heart. He spoke about the importance of family loyalty and authentic relationships, thanking everyone for their support during a difficult time and expressing gratitude for the bonds that had sustained him through personal challenges. "My mother taught me that family means showing up for each other, especially when it's difficult," he said, looking directly at me. "She's demonstrated that principle my entire life, and I'm grateful to be surrounded by people who share those same values." The applause that followed felt like validation, not just of our family reunion, but of every choice I'd made in raising Michael and every stand I'd taken in protecting our relationship. But the most meaningful moment of the day came later, during a quiet conversation with David's brother, Robert. He'd brought a box of photographs and letters that had belonged to David, items he'd been saving to share when the timing felt right. "David would be so proud of how you raised Michael," Robert told me as we looked through pictures of David's childhood and early marriage. "And he would be especially proud of how you handled this situation with Jessica. He always said you had more strength than you realized." Among the photographs was one I'd never seen before, taken at our wedding reception 38 years earlier. David and I were dancing, and his face showed such complete happiness and love that seeing it took my breath away. On the back, in David's careful handwriting, were the words, "Dancing with my future, October 15th, 1986. "He wrote that the night of your wedding," Robert explained. "He said he couldn't wait to see what kind of future you two would build together." Looking at that photograph, surrounded by family and celebrating the resolution of a crisis that had tested everything I believed about love and loyalty, I felt David's presence more strongly than I had since his death. The future he'd envisioned might not have unfolded exactly as we'd planned, but it had included raising a son who ultimately chose integrity over manipulation, family over superficial attractions. The reunion continued into the evening, with music and dancing that brought multiple generations together on the same dance floor. Michael danced with elderly aunts and young cousins alike, his smile genuine and relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since before he'd met Jessica. As the evening wound down and family members began their journeys home, the comments and expressions of gratitude confirmed that our decision to transform the wedding venue into a family celebration had been exactly right. We'd created something positive and meaningful from a situation that could have been purely destructive. The weeks following the reunion brought a sense of peace and normalcy that felt almost foreign after months of conflict and manipulation. Michael found a new apartment and began the process of building an independent life that honored both his autonomy and his family connections. He also began dating again, approaching new relationships with the wisdom that comes from surviving, manipulation, and deception. The woman he eventually introduced to me 6 months later was everything Jessica had pretended to be: genuine, kind, secure in herself, and genuinely interested in becoming part of our family, rather than replacing it. Sarah Martinez was a teacher at the elementary school where I'd done some volunteer work, and we'd actually met briefly before Michael started dating her. She was warm without being calculating, confident without being controlling, and she treated my relationship with Michael as something to be respected rather than eliminated. The first time Sarah joined us for Sunday dinner, the difference from Jessica's early visits was striking. Where Jessica had been performing for approval, Sarah was simply being herself. Where Jessica had been gathering information for future manipulation, Sarah was sharing genuine stories about her own family and background. Most tellingly, when I offered to help with planning their eventual wedding, Sarah's response was enthusiastic and grateful rather than suspicious and territorial. "I'd love your input," she told me sincerely. "Michael talks about you constantly, and I can see how much your relationship means to him. I want you to feel included in our celebration, not like an outsider looking in." The contrast with Jessica's approach was so dramatic that it confirmed everything I'd believed about the difference between healthy and manipulative relationships. Sarah saw my bond with Michael as an asset to their relationship rather than a threat to be eliminated. When Michael proposed to Sarah 18 months after the reunion, they chose to hold their engagement party at Willowbrook Manor. The venue that had been the center of so much conflict became the setting for genuine celebration, surrounded by family and friends who shared our joy rather than calculating how to exploit it. During the engagement party, Frank Morrison pulled me aside to share some information that provided perfect closure to the Jessica chapter of our lives. I thought, "You should know," he said quietly. "Jessica Richardson contacted us about booking the venue for her own wedding. Apparently, she's engaged to someone else now." I felt a moment of surprise, followed immediately by profound relief that this new man wasn't Michael. "Did you book her event?" Frank's smile was slight but unmistakably satisfied. "We told her we were fully booked for the foreseeable future. Some clients create more complications than our business model can accommodate." The knowledge that Jessica had moved on to manipulating someone else was troubling, but it also confirmed that Michael's escape from their relationship had been genuine liberation rather than temporary setback. As I watched Michael and Sarah dancing together at their engagement party, I felt the same sense of future possibility that David must have experienced at our own wedding decades earlier. This was what authentic love looked like: two people choosing each other without requiring the elimination of existing family bonds. The venue that Jessica had tried to use as a weapon in her campaign against me had become the setting for celebrating everything she'd tried to destroy: family loyalty, authentic relationships, and the triumph of integrity over manipulation. Standing in the garden at Willowbrook Manor, watching my son dance with a woman who genuinely loved him and welcomed his family, I understood that my investment in this property had returned dividends far beyond financial profit. It had become the place where our family's values were validated, and our bonds were strengthened rather than severed. The cancellation of Michael's first wedding had led to something far more valuable than any celebration Jessica could have planned. It had led to truth, to healing, and ultimately to a love that enhanced rather than diminished the connections that mattered most. David would have been proud of the future we'd built together, even though he wasn't there to see it unfold. And I was grateful for every difficult decision that had brought us to this moment of genuine happiness and authentic celebration. 2 years after Michael's engagement party with Sarah, I found myself standing in the bridal suite at Willowbrook Manor, watching my future daughter-in-law put the finishing touches on her wedding makeup. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow that seemed to promise nothing but happiness for the day ahead. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, which she'd had altered to fit perfectly while maintaining its timeless elegance. Her choice to wear a family heirloom rather than purchasing something new reflected everything I'd come to love about her character. She valued tradition, family history, and meaningful connections over superficial displays of wealth or status. "Mrs. Collins, could you help me with these buttons?" Sarah asked, turning to show me the long row of pearl buttons that ran up the back of her dress. Her voice carried just a hint of nervousness, but it was the good kind of nervous energy that comes from excitement rather than anxiety. As I carefully fastened each tiny button, I marveled at how different this morning felt from what Michael's first wedding day would have been. There was no tension in the air, no undercurrent of manipulation or hidden agendas. Just pure joy and anticipation for a celebration that would truly honor the love between two people who genuinely wanted to build a life together. "Thank you for everything you've done to make this day perfect," Sarah said, meeting my eyes in the antique mirror that dominated one wall of the bridal suite. "Michael told me about what happened with Jessica, and I want you to know how grateful I am that you protected him from making such a terrible mistake." I'd grown to appreciate Sarah's directness over the months I'd known her. She didn't dance around difficult topics or pretend that uncomfortable truths didn't exist. She acknowledged the reality of what had happened with Jessica while focusing on the positive outcome that had ultimately resulted. "Michael protected himself," I replied, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her veil. "I just refused to enable someone who was trying to destroy our family." "You did more than that," Sarah insisted, turning to face me directly. "You showed him what real love looks like. Love that supports and strengthens rather than manipulates and controls. That's a gift that will benefit our marriage for the rest of our lives." Through the window, I could see guests beginning to arrive and take their seats in the garden where the ceremony would be held. Unlike Jessica's planned event, which had been designed to impress rather than include, this gathering represented genuine community. Teachers from Sarah's school, longtime friends of Michael's, neighbors who'd become family over the years, and relatives who'd traveled from across the country to celebrate with us. The guest list reflected the values that both Michael and Sarah brought to their relationship. These were people who'd supported them through challenges and celebrated their successes. People who understood that marriage was about building something meaningful together, rather than achieving social status or financial advantage. "Are you nervous?" I asked Sarah as she took one final look in the mirror. "Not about marrying Michael," she replied without hesitation. "That's the easiest decision I've ever made. I'm nervous about walking down that aisle in front of everyone without tripping over my dress." Her honesty made me laugh, and I realized how refreshing it was to be with someone who didn't feel the need to perform perfection every moment. Sarah was comfortable with her humanity, her occasional awkwardness, her genuine emotions. She didn't need to maintain a carefully constructed facade because she had nothing to hide. A soft knock at the door interrupted our conversation, and Michael's voice called from the hallway. "Mom, is Sarah ready for our first look photos?" Sarah's face lit up with excitement. She and Michael had decided to see each other before the ceremony, sharing a private moment that would be captured by their photographer but kept intimate and personal. It was another reflection of their authenticity, choosing what felt right for them rather than following traditions that didn't resonate with their relationship. "Send him in," Sarah called back, and I stepped aside to give them space for their reunion. When Michael entered the bridal suite, his reaction to seeing Sarah in her wedding dress was everything a bride could hope for. His face showed pure wonder and love, and for a moment he seemed speechless. Then he crossed the room and took her hands, telling her she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Watching them together, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. If Jessica hadn't shown her true colors when she did, Michael might have spent years in a marriage that slowly eroded his confidence and damaged his family relationships. Instead, he'd found someone who enhanced every aspect of his life. The photographer captured their tender moments while I quietly slipped out to check on the ceremony preparations. As the mother of the groom, I had my own responsibilities to attend to, but more than that, I wanted to give Michael and Sarah the privacy they deserved for their special moment together. Walking through Willowbrook Manor's hallways, I encountered Frank Morrison making his final rounds to ensure everything was perfect for the ceremony. Over the years since my initial investment, Frank and I had developed a solid business partnership and genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. "Patricia, everything looks magnificent," Frank said, gesturing toward the garden where white chairs were arranged in perfect rows facing an arch covered with late summer flowers. "This is exactly what this venue was meant for, celebrating real love and authentic family connections." "It's funny how things work out," I replied, looking out at the scene that would soon be filled with people who genuinely cared about Michael and Sarah's happiness. When I first invested in this place, I was thinking about creating something beautiful for other families. I never imagined it would become so central to my own family's story. Frank smiled knowingly. The best investments always return more than we expect, especially when they're made with love rather than just profit in mind. His comment reminded me of how much my life had changed since David's death, and how the financial independence I'd achieved through careful investing had given me the freedom to make choices based on principle rather than necessity. The venue. Investment had provided financial returns, but more importantly, it had given me the power to protect my family when they needed protection most. As ceremony time approached, I made my way to the small room where Michael was getting ready with his groomsmen. The atmosphere was relaxed and jovial, filled with the easy camaraderie of men who'd known each other for years and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Michael looked handsome in his charcoal gray suit, but more than that, he looked peaceful and confident in a way that reminded me of David on our wedding day. There was no anxiety about the commitment he was making, no last-minute doubts or concerns, just quiet happiness and anticipation for the life he was about to begin with Sarah. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" I asked, straightening his tie, even though it was already perfect. "Like the luckiest man alive," he replied, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. "Mom, thank you for everything you did to make this day possible. Not just the venue or the planning, but for showing me what I deserved in a partner. You figured that out yourself," I reminded him. "I just refused to pretend that unacceptable behavior was acceptable. You taught me that love shouldn't require me to abandon the people who've supported me my entire life," Michael said, his voice becoming more serious. "Jessica wanted me to choose between her and you, but Sarah makes me feel like our family is stronger because she's part of it." The distinction was profound and reflected everything I'd hoped he would learn from his experience with Jessica. Healthy relationships enhanced existing bonds rather than requiring their destruction. Sarah understood that my close relationship with Michael was an asset to their marriage rather than a threat to be eliminated. Music began to play outside, signaling that it was time for the ceremony to begin. Michael's groomsmen headed toward the garden, leaving us alone for a moment that felt heavy with significance. "Your father would be so proud of the man you've become," I told him, adjusting his boutonniere one final time. "And he would love Sarah almost as much as I do." "I wish he could be here today," Michael said quietly. "He is here," I replied, meaning it completely. "Every value he taught you, every example he set about treating people with respect and integrity, That's all present in the choices you've made and the woman you've chosen to marry." We hugged tightly, and I felt the same overwhelming love and pride that had sustained me through all the challenges of raising him alone. This was what all those years of sacrifice had been for, to give him the foundation he needed to build a life filled with authentic love and meaningful relationships. The ceremony itself was everything a wedding should be: beautiful, meaningful, and focused entirely on the commitment Michael and Sarah were making to each other. As I watched them exchange vows they'd written themselves, I was struck by the honesty and vulnerability they shared so openly. Sarah promised to support Michael's dreams while pursuing her own, to honor his family relationships while building new traditions together, and to choose him every day. Not because she needed him to complete her, but because their partnership made both of them better people. Michael promised to love Sarah for exactly who she was, rather than trying to change her into someone else. To build a life that honored both their individual passions and their shared values, and to always remember that their marriage was strengthened by the family and friendships that had brought them together. Their vows were so different from the traditional words Jessica had planned to recite, generic promises that could have applied to any couple rather than specific commitments that reflected their unique relationship and shared values. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the joy that erupted from their guests was genuine and infectious. These were people who'd invested in Michael and Sarah's relationship, who'd supported them through challenges and celebrated their milestones. Their enthusiasm reflected real affection rather than social obligation. The reception that followed was equally authentic, filled with heartfelt toasts, joyful dancing, and the kind of celebration that creates lasting memories rather than impressive photographs. The food was delicious, the music was perfect, and the atmosphere was relaxed enough for genuine connection and conversation. During the parent dances, Michael chose a song that David had loved, and as we moved across the dance floor together, I felt my late husband's presence more strongly than I had in years. The boy I'd raised was now a man who understood the difference between superficial attraction and lasting love, and that understanding would serve him well in the years ahead. "Thank you for never giving up on me," Michael whispered as the song neared its end. "Even when I was too manipulated to see clearly, you knew what I needed, and you fought for it." "I fought for us," I corrected gently. "For our family and the values that matter most to us." As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with relatives and friends who'd witnessed the entire journey from Michael's broken engagement to this joyful celebration. The consensus was overwhelming that this wedding represented everything his first marriage would have lacked: authenticity, respect, and genuine love for all the people who mattered to him. Ellen pulled me aside during one of the slower songs to share her perspective on everything that had happened. "You know what I admire most about how you handled the Jessica situation?" she said, watching Michael and Sarah dance together with obvious happiness. "You never tried to turn Michael against her. You just refused to be mistreated and let the truth speak for itself." "I wanted him to make his own choice based on accurate information," I replied. "Manipulation never leads to lasting happiness, even when it gets you what you think you want in the short term." "Jessica thought she was so clever, turning Michael against you while keeping your financial support," Ellen continued. "But she underestimated your strength and overestimated her own influence. That combination was her downfall." Looking back, on that difficult period, I could see that Jessica's tactics had ultimately revealed more about her character than they'd damaged mine. Her willingness to manipulate someone she claimed to love, to lie and deceive for personal advantage, had eventually become impossible to hide. The evening's most touching moment came during the speeches, when Sarah stood to address the gathered guests. Instead of the typical bride's thank you remarks, she chose to speak specifically about family and the importance of choosing partners who enhanced rather than diminished existing relationships. "When I first met Michael, I was struck by how much he talked about his mother," Sarah began, looking directly at me. Some women might have felt threatened by such a close mother-son relationship, but I felt envious. I could see that Patricia had raised a man who understood what real love looked like, and I knew that would make him a better husband to me. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. Patricia, thank you for showing Michael that love means supporting each other's growth, not controlling each other's choices. Thank you for teaching him that family loyalty and romantic love aren't competing priorities, but complementary values that make life richer and more meaningful. The applause that followed Sarah's words felt like validation of every difficult decision I'd made during the Jessica crisis. Standing up for my dignity and refusing to accept mistreatment hadn't just protected my relationship with Michael, it had demonstrated the kind of strength and integrity that Sarah found attractive in our family. As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Michael and Sarah took a few minutes to walk through the gardens with me, reflecting on the day and expressing their gratitude for everything that had made their celebration possible. I keep thinking about how different this would have been if I'd married Jessica, Michael said, his arm around Sarah's waist as we strolled among the late summer flowers. Not just the wedding itself, but our whole life together. She would have spent our entire marriage trying to minimize your role in my life. Instead, I get to gain a second mother, Sarah added, squeezing my hand. Someone who's already shown me what it means to love unconditionally and fight for the people who matter most. Their words filled my heart with more happiness than I'd experienced since David's death. This was what I'd dreamed of when Michael was young, that he would find someone who appreciated the bond we shared rather than resenting it. As we prepared to leave Willowbrook Manor that evening, I took one last look at the venue that had played such a central role in our family's story. The space that Jessica had tried to use as a weapon against me had become the setting for celebrating everything she'd tried to destroy. The investment I'd made years earlier had returned dividends beyond anything I could have calculated. Not just financial profits, but the power to protect my family when they needed protection most, and the setting for celebrations that honored our values rather than undermining them. 6 months after the wedding, I received a phone call that provided perfect closure to the Jessica chapter of our lives. It was Carol Richardson, calling to share news about her daughter's latest relationship developments. Patricia, I thought you should know that Jessica's second engagement has ended, Carol said, her voice heavy with disappointment and concern. Apparently, she tried the same tactics with her new fiancé's family that she used with you and Michael. What happened? She convinced him to cut contact with his sister, claiming that the sister was trying to interfere in their relationship. But unlike Michael, this man's family didn't accept the manipulation quietly. They confronted Jessica directly and made it clear to their son that he needed to choose between his fiancé and his family. I felt a mixture of sadness for Jessica's continued destructive behavior and relief that another family had recognized and stopped her manipulation before it could cause lasting damage. How did Jessica's fiancé respond? He chose his family, Carol replied, just like Michael eventually did. Jessica's pattern of trying to isolate partners from their support systems keeps backfiring because healthy people don't want to abandon the people who love them. Carol's call confirmed what I'd suspected during our conflict with Jessica. Her manipulative tactics weren't unique to our situation. They were her standard approach to relationships. She viewed existing family bonds as obstacles to be eliminated, rather than assets to be embraced. I'm sorry this is happening again, I told Carol sincerely. It must be heartbreaking to watch your daughter repeat the same destructive patterns. It is, Carol admitted. But it also makes me grateful that Michael escaped when he did. Jessica's behavior is getting worse, not better, and anyone who stays with her long-term will suffer the consequences. The knowledge that Jessica continued to sabotage her own relationships provided a sobering reminder of how close Michael had come to a lifetime of manipulation and isolation. His willingness to confront the truth about her behavior and choose family loyalty over romantic infatuation had literally saved him from years of emotional abuse. As I hung up from Carol's call, I felt profoundly grateful for the strength I'd found during our crisis with Jessica. Standing up for myself and refusing to accept mistreatment hadn't just protected my relationship with Michael, it had modeled the kind of boundaries that healthy relationships require. Today, 3 years after Michael's wedding to Sarah, our family continues to thrive in ways that would have been impossible if Jessica had succeeded in her campaign against me. Michael and Sarah have bought their first home, just 15 minutes from mine, and they include me in their lives naturally and comfortably. Sarah and I have developed our own friendship independent of her relationship with Michael, bonding over shared interests in gardening and community volunteer work. She seeks my advice on everything from career decisions to decorating choices, not because she feels obligated to include me, but because she values my perspective and experience. Michael has grown into the kind of husband and son that David would be proud of. Someone who understands that love multiplies rather than divides, that healthy relationships enhance rather than diminish the connections that came before them. My investment in Willowbrook Manor continues to provide both financial returns and personal satisfaction. The venue has become known throughout the region for hosting celebrations that prioritize meaning over spectacle, attracting couples who want their weddings to reflect their values rather than their social aspirations. Frank and I have expanded the business to include corporate retreats focused on team building and authentic leadership, using the venue's peaceful setting to help organizations develop the kind of genuine connections that lead to lasting success. But the most valuable return on my investment has been the knowledge that when my family needed protection, I had the resources and the courage to provide it. The financial independence I'd built through careful saving and smart investing gave me the power to enforce boundaries and demand respect when it mattered most. Standing in my garden this morning, tending the roses that will soon provide flowers for Sarah's birthday celebration, I feel a deep sense of contentment and purpose. The life I've built since David's death has been different from what we originally planned, but it's been rich with meaning and filled with authentic relationships. The crisis with Jessica taught me that love without boundaries isn't actually love at all. It's enabling. Real love sometimes requires difficult conversations, firm limits, and the courage to accept temporary conflict in service of long-term well-being. Michael learned those same lessons, and they've made him a better husband, son, and eventually will make him a better father when he and Sarah decide to start their family. The strength he found to choose truth over manipulation will serve him well in every relationship for the rest of his life. As for Jessica, I hope she eventually learns that lasting happiness comes from building people up rather than tearing them down, from enhancing relationships rather than destroying them. But that's her journey to make, and her lessons to learn. My focus remains on nurturing the authentic connections that fill my life with joy and purpose. Family dinners where conversation flows freely because no one is performing or calculating. Advantage. Holiday celebrations that honor tradition while creating new memories. Quiet moments in my garden where I can feel David's presence and know that the future we dreamed of, while different than expected, has been beautiful beyond measure. The venue that once threatened to become a symbol of manipulation and exclusion has instead become a testament to the power of standing firm in your values and refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. Sometimes the most important investments aren't financial at all. They're investments in dignity, integrity, and the courage to protect what matters most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up, just click and check them out.